Welcome back. We talked last time about the change that England is making in the way it runs its empire. The change came about because, ironically, England won the 7 Years' War, acquired a vast amount of territory, became a much richer empire with that whole vast area of the American West under its control instead of France's. So that's a great victory, very positive thing for England. But it required them to take a look at their colonial administration. And specifically, the issue that I've talked about so far, there will be some others that we'll get to, but the thing that acquiring that territory forced England to do was to say, what are we going to do about the Indians out there? And as I told you last time, they decided so far to do two things about the Indians. One, try to minimize problems with the Indians by prohibiting Americans from settling in the West under the Proclamation Line of 1763. And then deciding to leave soldiers in America. Now that's a change. England has never done that before. They have never had troops, regular soldiers, stationed in North America. They've always left the militias the responsibility of providing for whatever defense was necessary. Defense was not usually very an issue, but to the extent that it was provided by the militias. Now England has decided to keep troops in North America. And then that leads to the next very, very significant change. England says, if we're going to be spending all that money on the troops in America, we have to get that money from somewhere. And they decided that half of it should come from the Americans, which means they're going to make what is a very, very significant change in the way they run their empire. They are now going to tax Americans, something that they had never done before. They had never needed to do it before. Now they are. And we talked last time about the two acts that Parliament passed, the so-called Sugar Act of 1764 and the Stamp Act of 1765. Well, at the end of the hour, I told you that today I would talk about the American reaction to those taxes. The reaction to this Sugar Act is not very much of a story. There's not much to talk about that. There was not much of a reaction. A couple of the assemblies adopted resolutions criticizing it and saying, well, you're raising taxes on us. And people in Parliament replied, wait a minute, the tax is reduced. But we actually lowered the tax. And the English and then the Americans said, yeah, but there's a difference because when it was really high, you didn't actually intend to collect it. You just were using a high tax as a way to prevent trade. And now you're actually trying to tax it, so you're collecting revenue from us. Okay, yeah, but, and then so there's some correspondence goes back and forth complaining about this. But that's about all, just some correspondence, some written resolutions, and nothing more. But the Stamp Act, oh my God. The reaction within America was very noticeable, very dramatic, very strong and forceful. A number of things happened that Americans did in response to the Stamp Act. Probably the most prominent or the most noticeable thing that Americans did was to engage in violent demonstrations. There were demonstrations throughout America, in all throughout the colonies. There were protests, there were rallies, there were demonstrations, and many of them turned violent. The protests against the Stamp Act were oftentimes directed against the clerks who worked for the British government and whose job it is to actually just to handle the actual transactions, to actually handle the stamps, sell the stamps, take the money, pass it on, see that it goes into the proper treasury routes and so forth and so on. Just the clerical people who handle this. These are just staff people working for the British government with the responsibility of administering the Stamp Act. Man, some of those poor guys were attacked by mobs. Some of them were beaten up. One of the very popular things that Americans did was called tarring and feathering. They would cover a person with hot tar and then dump them into a barrel of feathers and cover his body with feathers. Nobody got killed in this, but people got hurt. This is a very painful experience to go through. It's extremely painful. It can be disabling. It can be disfiguring. This is a very, very ugly thing to do to people. And a number of these clerks, many of them who are Americans just looking for a job, getting a job for the government, collecting taxes, and many of them were harmed physically. And their families were threatened. I mean, it's one thing to go down to the office and complain and yell and scream outside the offices of the tax collectors or whatever, but sometimes the mob followed the clerks home, threatened their homes, threatened their families, sat around and hung them in effigy, and frightened a lot of the poor guys whose job it is to administer the law. There's just a great deal of violence in America as protests against this hateful act. At a somewhat less violent and less outrageous measure, the assemblies took the lead in opposing it. And what they did was to communicate among themselves and decide that they should get together and establish a unified response in opposition to the Stamp Act. They're going to act together. Now, I'm always amused by this. It was just a couple of years earlier. It was just, 11 years earlier, before the war, at the Albany Plan of Union, that the people there, led by Ben Franklin, had tried to get some cooperation and some mutual activity jointly among the different colonies, and it had been soundly rejected, emphatically rejected by all of the colonies. Now, in response to this tax measure, which is talking now about money, the colonies, the different assemblies decided, let's us coordinate our efforts, let's have a sort of a combined response to this, and let's get together and talk about how we should respond and what we can do to show our disapproval of this act. So they decided to have a meeting together. The word that they used was Congress, and that gets to be kind of a complex word for us, because that word has evolved, as we will see. We'll trace its evolution through. But initially it meant just a bunch of people getting together. They're going to call it a Congress, a meeting together. So they said, let's have a Stamp Act Congress, and we'll all meet together. Let's go to New York, and each of the assemblies will send some delegates to New York to the Congress. Each assembly will choose 4 or 5 of their own members, or somebody from their colony, to go to New York, and we'll all get together at this Congress, and we'll have a discussion of what we're going to do about the Stamp Act. As it turned out, only 9 of the assemblies were able to get this done. I don't know the details in the other 4. Every colony is sort of different, and each of them had to respond to this differently. But there's problems of communication and transportation and just getting the word out, and then the assemblies have to have special meetings, and they have to choose delegates, and the delegates have to make transportation arrangements to get up to New York. 4 of the colonies didn't get it done, but the other 9 did. And they met together in New York in what now is called the Stamp Act Congress, a meeting of people from each of the assemblies to talk about a matter of common concern, the Stamp Act. And what they did was to adopt a series of resolves, as they were called, resolutions. The word they used was resolves. These are now called the Stamp Act Resolves. I don't know if it's a coincidence or not, but there are 13 of them. That magic number is 13. 13 Stamp Act Resolves were adopted by the Congress. And they spelled out why Americans objected to the Stamp Act. And it spells out where the Americans are. And this is a very, very important document, the Stamp Act Resolves, because it shows us what Americans are thinking about as of 1765. And they've got a measure there that Parliament has passed that they do not like, and they're explaining why. They base their theories, their arguments, and step by step they go through 13 points, explaining this point, this point, this point. And they base a lot of this on the ideas of John Locke that I mentioned to you previously. John Locke and the idea that government exists to protect natural rights, and that natural rights can be defined as life, liberty, and property. If you didn't get that before, be sure you get it now, because this is the basis of what everything depends on. This is what country's built on. The Stamp Act Resolves is one of our important founding documents explaining what we are as a nation. And we are a nation that says that government exists to protect natural rights, life, liberty, and property. Of those, not a surprise, the most important is probably property, because that's money, and money is what makes the world go round. And what the Americans said was that taxes are a form of money. Taxes are property. In a tax, the government is taking your money. And their argument is the government cannot do that. The government cannot take your money. The government cannot tax. Make sure you understand that. If you don't, you can send me an email or come to the office hour and talk about it, because I want to make sure you understand this. No, the government cannot tax us. The government cannot take our property, our money, in taxes. That's the key. Government cannot take your property. The government is there to protect your property. The only way the government can get money is if people give it to the government. Taxes cannot be something that the government takes. It has to be something that people give. People have to recognize that the government needs money. People have to realize that, if they want to have courts to decide disputes, if they want to have some kind of law and order, if they want to have some kind of physical infrastructure, they have very little infrastructure, but if you want to have some kind of roads or something like that, and the government is the only one that can build those, the government needs money. So we have to decide we are going to give money to the government. That's the way it has to work. Then it's legitimate. As a practical matter, we don't all have to somehow do it. There's no reasonable, manageable way for the people to act as a whole country. Instead, a logical and perfectly legitimate way to go about is for the people to choose representatives. That's what you have as a government in a republic. That's what we want. We want republics. People choose their representatives. We're going to have a Republican government, which is different from a Democratic government. A Democratic government is a government by the people. That's not what we want. We want a republic, which is government by representatives elected by the people. Which would mean in America, we're talking about, as a practical matter, our assemblies. That's why our assemblies can tax us. And they've been doing that forever, because we elect the members of our assemblies. We elect them as our representatives, and we entrust them to act on our behalf. That's what they are there to do. They are to act in our place. They are to be our representatives, and they then decide to tax, and we then are consenting to that by electing them, by entrusting them with the power to be representatives. We are giving them the ability to tax us, and we have agreed in advance to consent to their decisions. And as a matter of fact, in a republic, the way we work this is that we have majority rule. The majority of representatives makes a decision. You may not like the decision, but you've consented to it. You've elected representatives. You've said we're going to have a system. We're going to have this formal procedure by which the representatives will meet and they will assess taxes. And we agree to pay the taxes because we elect the representatives to act on our behalf and to consent to the taxes. And that's what it has to be. We have to consent to the taxes through our representatives. A phrase that's going to come out of the Stamp Act Congress is a set of 4 words that I tell students all the time. Remember these 4 words. These are the 4 words that are the basis of the American position here. No taxation without representation. No taxation without representation. Which means that the only form of taxation that we can accept is by our assemblies, which is the way it's been working forever. Our assemblies from day one have been taxing us, and we have accepted that, we agree to that, we buy into that system. It's the way things work. We elect representatives, the representatives impose taxes, we accept the taxes, we pay the taxes because they are passed by our representatives. But the Stamp Act is passed by Parliament. And Parliament is not our representative body. So Parliament cannot tax us. And what they care about here is not the money. It's not that the Stamp Act is so oppressive. In fact, if you kind of think about it, most Americans probably would not pay the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act is going to fall heavily on lawyers who are always negotiating contracts, and they have to file the contracts. I mean, that's what they do. That's what lawyers do. They write up contracts and so forth. And the contracts have to have a stamp on it, so they're not valid to that. It's going to affect newspapers because newspapers have to pay a stamp. They have to have a stamp on the newspaper. So it affects the newspapers. The average person, hardly ever has a contract. They hardly ever have a legal issue where they have to have a legal document that has to have a stamp on it. Most people in the country are not going to be paying taxes. What Americans object to is the fact that the Parliament is doing something that has always been left up to our assemblies. So what Americans see here in the Stamp Act is an attempt to undermine their assemblies. Parliament is taking away a right, a power, an activity that had always been performed by our assemblies. And our assemblies are a big part of what we identify as our freedom. The fact that we have the right to elect our assemblies, that most of us, well, careful, remember when I say us, I'm only talking about white males. You know, I don't need to keep reminding you of that. I hope you always remember that this only applies to white males. So, and as a matter of fact, only to white male property owners. So, you know, keep that in mind. But when you understand that, that's all we're talking about here. And I don't need to keep reminding you of that. I hope I don't have to say it up. Excuse me, I don't have to say it every time. But we've always had a society in which large numbers of people own land. They have that freedom that comes with owning land. As a landowner, they have freedom. They have the right to take care of themselves. People have freedom, and one of the things that comes with that freedom is the right to vote and to elect your representatives, and the representatives govern you, and it's only the representatives who tax you, and that's the way it's supposed to work. But Parliament doesn't fit into that. Parliament is here, as Americans see it, taking away their freedom, taking away their the ability of their assemblies to tax them, and only the assemblies tax them, because only the assemblies are representative. No taxation without representation. Parliament cannot tax us. So that was the key then to that summarizes the meaning of the Stamp Act resolves. Those were actually drafted as a letter to the king. England has a new king, a relatively young king. King George III has only been king since 1760. This is now 1765. He's still a young guy, he's in his 20s. And it's addressed to him, and it says, "Your Majesty, we are your loyal subjects in America. We love you. We are happy to have you as our monarch." When George III had become king in 1760, there were celebrations throughout his empire to hail him as the incoming king and to honor him as his when he is throned and so forth. And nowhere in the British Empire were the celebrations, the parties, the festivities to honor this new king. Nowhere were they more extravagant or more outstanding than in his North American colonies. The people of North America loved their king. They saw their king as the key to protecting their rights. That's what kings do. They protect our rights. We in America have an English king. He's not an absolute power. He doesn't have a great deal of power, but that's what he's supposed to be. He's supposed to be under the authority of Parliament, and he doesn't have absolute power. He can't tax us. He never does. He doesn't bother us. Yeah, I mean, we love him because he leaves us alone, salutary neglect, but he lets us be ourselves. But that's why we're so lucky. That's why we love him so much. It's because he's a good king. He's not like those dirty kings that they have in Spain and France who are absolute power and they run their empires and they have all this power. This is a king who has limited power and who allows us to have our assemblies and to tax ourselves and to govern ourselves in all ways. So we love you, Your Majesty. And it's not you that's doing this, it's Parliament. Parliament is the bad guys. And Your Majesty, maybe you don't know what's going on in England, but the Parliament is doing terrible things. They are violating our rights. We know you will protect our rights because you're a good king. You're the kind of king that we want, that we need, that we have in England. We are English subjects. We have you as a king, and please intercede to help us with Parliament. Now, this is a pretty stupid argument if you look at this factually, and I've often wondered if these guys actually believed what they were saying. I can't believe that they actually thought that was the case. They must have just been saying that because that's sort of the politically correct thing to say, you know, to praise the king or so forth. The reality was that the king was actively involved in working with Parliament. King George III certainly knew that as King of England, he could not act against Parliament. He can't be trying to fight Parliament the way that his grandfather and his great-grandfather, one of whom had been executed and one of whom had been almost executed, the way they had done. You've got to become an English king, but that doesn't mean that you just ignore what's going on. The way you do it, the way you become an active king, is you work with Parliament. You sort of go in and have your allies in Parliament. There are members of Parliament who are sort of pro-monarch. There are some that are anti-monarch in the politics. You work with the pro-monarchs. You negotiate, you deal. You get down and dirty and deal and go into back rooms and work out deals and compromises and stuff like that. But you're actively involved. So the king was actively aware of what was going on and what Parliament was doing. He was a part of it. But so these Americans say this, and I say I don't know that they actually believed it, but they sort of make it seem as though they're going to tell the king, Your Majesty, Parliament is doing bad things, and he says, oh my God, I never knew. Well, that's stupid, but that's the way they set it up. They said, we know that you have always protected the rights of your subjects. We are your subjects. We are asking you to protect our rights against these bad guys in Parliament. So they sent this message. Of course it goes to Parliament. And Parliament looks at this and they say, what are they talking about? We understand that there's no taxation without representation. I mean, that's what we do. We're Parliament. The king does not have the power to impose taxes. It's us. And it's us because we are the representatives. We represent the people. That's why we can tax. We represent all the people of the British Empire, and that's why we can tax. We agree with the idea of no taxation without representation. But we're the representatives, so we can tax. Now this may seem a little bit confusing. You may be asking yourself, what the hell is going on here? I'm not following this. The problem is, people in America, the members of the assemblies, the guys who went to the Stamp Act Congress, the guys who adopted the Stamp Act resolves, and they have all of these ideas, and they talk about representation, but to them, a key issue is that representatives have to be elected by the people. Now today, political scientists call that actual representation. Actual representation. It means that the people elect their representatives. And that kind of makes sense in America because most of the people vote. Again, white males, but I'm not going to constantly point that out. But 75% of the people can vote. In England, it doesn't make any sense because so few people can vote anyway. Only 5% of the people can vote. White males. So what England defines as representative, what the members of Parliament mean by representation, is what political scientists call virtual representation. These terms will all be on the list that I put out with each lecture. Virtual representation. And that means that they don't have to be elected. It doesn't matter how they get chosen. The fact is, they act as representatives. They act on behalf of all the people. They are acting there as representatives because it's incomprehensible to have, the whole country, 8 million people get together and have a meeting. Instead, they have representatives, and Parliament are the representatives. So Parliament represents the people. And they don't have to be elected. They don't have to be voted on. So that doesn't, so they represent the 95% of the people in England that don't vote. They represent the people in Ireland who don't vote. They represent the people in the British colonies in the Caribbean who don't vote. They represent the people in North America who don't vote. You don't have to vote in order to have a representative. Parliament is your representative. So Parliament looks at this and say, what the Americans are saying doesn't make any sense. They're saying that we can't tax. What do you mean we can't tax? Then they turn around and they say, no taxation without representation. They say Parliament can't tax. Well, hell, we're the representatives, so of course we can tax. So this doesn't go anywhere. People are just saying different things, and it's sort of weird because they're saying the same thing, but they define the term differently. It becomes down to sort of what does the word representative mean? And it means one thing to Americans, in which case the Stamp Act is a violation of their rights, and it means another thing to the members of Parliament, in which case the Stamp Act is perfectly legitimate. So where do you go with that? It's, until you figure out that you have different meanings of the word representation. So it goes nowhere. So nothing comes of the Stamp Act resolves. Nothing comes of their plea to the monarch. Meanwhile, the riots are going on. The Stamp Act is unenforceable. None of the stamps even got sold. Not one penny was ever contributed to paying for the stamps. The Stamp Act resulted in zero income for Parliament to help pay the bills. In some cases, the stamps themselves, they were shipped over to start the process of selling them, and a mob went in and destroyed them. I mean, the mobs are just running throughout the cities, tearing places down, attacking people, hurting people, and going into the offices where the stamps are actually being set there to start selling them, and they burn the stamps so they're not actually being sold. And the mob violence is just out of control. And in addition, then, many of the merchants of America who are, a lot of close ties between the merchants and the assemblies. A lot of the members of the assemblies are merchants or tied to them politically or personally or family or whatever. So the same communication network that the assemblies are using to make these plans to meet together and so forth is also being used by the merchants to set up boycotts of British goods. So Americans are not buying British goods, and in a lot of places there are local merchants who want to still continue to sell British goods, and then the mob comes in and demolishes their store or something like that. The mobs are just running out of control throughout America, and they're destroying property of merchants who are pro-British and still trying to engage in trade, even though there's a protest going on. And so they get their stores demolished or damaged or something. And this is kind of ironic because, the whole idea here is protecting property rights. The idea of a tax is a property, and that's why the government can't take it without your consent, without your representatives consenting. And then the mob goes out and destroys the property of businesses that won't cooperate with them. So there's a kind of a contradiction there. But the trade between the American colonies and England is down. English merchants are hurting. English merchants are going to Parliament saying you got to do something about this. And so Parliament in March of 1766 repealed the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act went into effect in November of 1765. It was on the books for 4 months. In March of 1766, it was repealed. It never, as I said, it never produced a penny of revenue for the Royal Treasury. From a financial standpoint, it was a complete failure. So Parliament has repealed the act, and the violence can now stop. But at the same time, literally the same day that Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, they passed a law called the Declaratory Act. It's the Declaratory Act of March 1766. And it doesn't actually do anything. It's just, as its name suggests, a declaration. It's just a declaration by Parliament. And it says that Parliament is the supreme governing body of the British Empire. I mean, this has been something that Parliament has been talking about for 100 years. Parliamentary supremacy. Parliament is supreme within the English government. It is the governing body. It can govern in any way that it likes. It can pass any law that it wishes, whether it be a tax or some other argument. I mean, the Americans have been saying, yeah, Parliament can regulate our trade, because Parliament has been doing that with the Navigation Acts for 100 years. The Navigation Acts have been around. For the most part, the Americans obey them. Occasionally they don't, but then that's okay because, you know, who cares? A little smuggling here and there is okay. But Americans accept the fact that Parliament has the right to regulate their trade. It's just they can't tax. Well, Parliament says in the Declaratory Act, there's no difference between regulating trade and taxing. Parliament can pass any law that it wishes. And it can pass laws for all British subjects, whether they live in England or America or Jamaica or wherever. British subjects are under the rule of Parliament. And that's what Parliament declares. Now, it's just a declaration. So it says that, okay, we've given up on taxes. We're not going to tax you, but we're not accepting your argument that we can't. We still say we can. We're just not doing it at the moment, or not continuing with the Stamp Act. So the Stamp Act is gone, but the issue is still very much alive. All right, now the issue is now the next thing we have to look at, though, or Parliament has to look at, yeah, but we still need the money. You know, we were counting on that Stamp Act for some money. What are we going to do? We gotta pay the soldiers. You know, somebody's got to pay those bills, and somebody's got to get the money. So the guy who's now going to be sort of the leading actor for Parliament is a guy named Charles Townshend. Charles Townshend, young guy. He's from a political party other than the Pitt Party, and the Pitt Party is out of power. You'd have to look at all of the English factions and groups within Parliament, but the people sort of, there's all these different factions. The Pitt faction had sort of been controlling England like during the war, but now they've lost power because of political changes in England. And one of the issues is that William Pitt himself is sort of not able to act. I think I told you that he was a pretty capable and pretty bright guy, but he had health problems, and sadly both physical and mental health problems. And he was just not functioning. He just would sit in his house. He still technically was a member of Parliament. As a matter of fact, he got promoted to the House of Lords, as an award for his service. He was given a knighthood, and so he's now a member of the House of Lords. But he's just staying at home, and nobody could communicate with him. It's kind of weird. People would go by his house and they'd see the lights were on inside the house, and they figured he's there, and they'd knock on the door and nobody would answer. He was just gone, and that's too bad. Some historians have said that if William Pitt had been alive and well, because he understood the Americans, he was the pro-American guy, and that he might have gotten through this without the problems that England had, but he's out of the picture. He and his faction would vote against tax measures and so forth, but they'd lose. They'd account for maybe 20–25% of the votes in Parliament, but they could never win. So now the leader is this guy, Charles Townshend, and he's trying to figure out what we can do to get some money out of the Americans. We need the money. and not have the problems with the riots and everything. And he notices the obvious fact that I wonder if any of you picked up on this. The protests against the Sugar Act, which was actually the first tax, were very mild, almost unnoticeable, in contrast to the mass violence of the Stamp Act. And he says there's one tax that is not a problem, and then another tax is a huge problem. We can't even do it. We had to repeal it because it was unenforceable, it was unusable. So I wonder why that is. So there were some Americans in London who were there as lobbyists for some of the assemblies. The assemblies, of course, didn't have any vote in Parliament, but many of them would hire some sort of a representative to act as their lobbyist to go over and sort of talk to the members of Parliament and try to explain how they felt. And one of the key ones is a familiar name, Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin was there as an agent for his assembly in Pennsylvania, and he had a couple other clients that he was representing as well, and he would argue on their behalf before Parliament. So Townsend met with Franklin and said, what is this? Why did the Sugar Act have a very limited protest, and the Stamp Act was just crazy? And Franklin explained to him, well, look, these are different kinds of taxes. He said the Sugar Act is what we could call an external tax, and the Stamp Act is what we could call an internal tax. Today, economists would use the terms, that sort of slightly different terminology that modern economists would use. The Sugar Act is an indirect tax. The Stamp Act is a direct tax. The Sugar Act taxes the import of goods. That's why he called it an external tax. It's coming from outside the country. It actually taxes the merchants. It doesn't tax the people. It doesn't tax consumers. Now, the assumption is, and the whole theory behind the tax is, that the merchants who are going to be selling the sugar to consumers will add to the price in order to pay the tax. Well, they may or they may not, but it's the merchants who pay the tax to the government, not the people. It's not a direct tax, it's an indirect tax. The government taxes the merchants then pass the tax on to the consumer. And eventually the people may pay, but they don't pay directly, they don't pay anything to the government. By contrast, the Stamp Act is a direct tax. It's a tax on the people. They pay the government themselves. So the idea is, and Townsend went away from this lunch with Franklin, and he said, I get it. Americans will accept an indirect tax. They only protest against direct taxes. Okay, so the solution is obvious. We have some indirect taxes. So in 1767 then, because the government still needs the money, Townsend proposed to Congress, to Parliament, what is called the Townsend duties. Duty is another word for tariff. This is a tax on 5 goods imported into America from England. It's a tax on imports, and therefore it's an indirect tax that people are not actually going to pay the tax. The merchants will pay the tax, and then at their discretion they will charge higher prices to the consumers. The 5 goods that Townsend is proposing to tax, the Townsend duties, apply to paint, lead, paper, glass, and tea. Paper, paint, lead, glass, and tea. Now those first 4 are kind of examples of the manufactured goods that England was producing and importing to America. As I've told you, America are a bunch of farmers. We produce raw materials, we export those, and then we pay for all of the manufactured goods that we need. We import all the manufactured goods, mostly from England. And those are things that are manufactured. There's a little bit of an overlap there because lead is something that is only produced in England. It's only refined there. But lead is used in making paint and glass. So those are it's sort of a product altogether, lead-based, and then paint and paper, stuff like that. And those are things that Americans have to import. If you want some paint, there's no paint in America, you buy it from English manufacturers. And now you're going to have to pay a tax on it, or the merchant is going to have to pay a tax on it, the importer. Tea is in a little bit different category. Tea is not actually produced in England. First of all, it's not a manufactured good per se. It's an agricultural product, and it's not grown in England. It's grown in Asia. I think, I'm not 100% sure, I think most of the English tea plantations were in the modern-day nation of Sri Lanka. But the English had a number of tea plantations down in this South Asian country, modern-day Sri Lanka. And the plantations grew it, and then it was imported into England by a company. And there was a company that had a monopoly by law of all the trade between England and Asia. That was the East India Company. The East India Company had a monopoly of that trade. So it was the East India Company that would import the tea from Sri Lanka, or maybe other places in Asia. I'm not sure. I just, because I don't know much about Asian history. But I think a lot of it was, because I know that there were a lot of English tea plantations in Sri Lanka. So it's imported into England, and then some of it is exported to America. But the reality is, Americans consume very little English tea. The East India Company didn't have very many customers in America because the Americans were getting their tea from, guess, smugglers. They buy a lot of stuff from smugglers. In this case, it was mostly the Dutch. And the Dutch had tea plantations in what is now Indonesia. I think the island of Java had a lot of Dutch tea plantations on it. The tea was grown there. It was then exported from the Netherlands East Indies to the Netherlands, from there to the Netherlands West Indies in the Caribbean, and from there shipped to America. Well, that's illegal trade. That's covered. The tea was also covered by the Molasses Act. The Molasses Act covered a wide range of products. The molasses it's called the Molasses Act because it focuses on molasses and sugar, but other things were done. So the tea that Americans consume is smuggled tea. They didn't drink much of the legal tea from the East India Company because they just dealt with the Dutch down in the West Indies, and they smuggled stuff in. So that's not really an issue. But the tax was on tea if there had been any legal tea, and there was some. I don't know how much, but there was some legal tea, and so that's not being taxed. And Townsend was pretty smart, pretty proud of himself. He was kind of a smart-ass guy. He was kind of obnoxious, to tell you the truth, but he said, hey, I've solved the problem. My predecessors couldn't figure out a way to tax the Americans legally and get away with it, but I've come up with a solution. I've come up with this idea of indirect taxes on these Townsend duties, so everything's going to be fine. Well, it wasn't. Poor old Charlie Townsend. Ben Franklin probably didn't know what he was talking about, and historians are not sure whether he really did or whether he was just wrong or whether what he was saying was right when he said it, and then Americans changed their minds. Then Americans said, well, no, we don't accept any tax, because the reaction to the Townsend duties was just the same old violence, riots, attacks on the tax collectors, all kinds of unhappy things happening. Not as much violence, but it's the same thing. A lot of violent protests. The poor suckers whose job it was to administer the laws are being tarred and feathered again. That's a tough job. I mean, who wants that kind of a job? where your neighbors are going to come in and beat you up. But that's what was happening. And a boycott, the merchants started boycotting goods again. And once again, there are a lot of people in America who approved of these things. There are a lot of pro-British Americans, pro-Parliament Americans, and some of them were in business, but then they were getting their stores destroyed. The mob would come out and destroy their property. So it's not very well. England tried to make a go of it for a couple of years. And they did collect some revenue, but never as much as it was supposed to. And it was getting really hard to collect it. And in fact, in some places, there's so much violence that the English have had to send the army into the cities. Army headquarters were in New York, but then the authorities in Boston had to send to New York for help because there was so much violence in Boston. Boston was the center of most of the violence. There was violence everywhere, but it was the worst in Boston. So there are some troops in Boston designed to fight the mobs, keep the mobs in check. Local law enforcement, which was sometimes under the control of the assemblies, local law enforcement just wasn't up to the job. So there were people there who were pro-England, said we've got to have some troops here. So the army has reassigned some troops to Boston. One of the reasons why the violence was the most serious in Boston was because the headquarters for the agency to collect the tax, which I'll have to talk about later, the headquarters of that agency were actually in Boston. So that's where the violence was the worst. That building, which is still standing incidentally, in downtown Boston, was the center of some very violent protests. On March 5th, 1770, this is now 3 years after the law has been in effect, there's another one of many demonstrations in Boston. There was the army is there to provide security at the building where the headquarters were located, where the actual administration of the law had its offices. And there's some couple of soldiers there as sentries to guard the building and protect the staff. And it was clear that the mob was so bad, there was so much violence going on, that the British Army sent some other troops over. They sent a force of 8 soldiers under an officer whose name I forget, but I think his name is in the book. But these 8 troops and the officer came over to deal with this mob. And the mob, they're throwing rocks. This is March. They're throwing snowballs. They're throwing everything at the poor sentries there. The 8 soldiers came in, fired well, they were not supposed to. The officer had given orders that they were not to fire their weapons, but they came in, and one of the soldiers saw all of this mob against him. He panicked. He fired his gun. The officer came up to him and said, "Why did you do that? Why did you fire? I told you not to fire." Well, of course, all the soldiers heard was the word fire, so they all began shooting into the crowd. And when the dust had settled, March 5th, 1770, that morning 3 of the people had died, 3 of the people were killed, and 2 others died later. 5 people killed. This is the first time anybody's actually lost their lives in all of these demonstrations, all of the riots that have been going on. There have been no deaths. Now there were 5. Well, this was a tough thing because, in fact, a couple of days earlier, Parliament had finally said, well, this towns and duties are not worth it. They're not producing very much revenue. We're actually spending more money on keeping soldiers in Boston than we are on keeping soldiers out of the forts. We've got more soldiers in Boston to deal with the mobs than we do out in Pittsburgh to deal with the Indians. And in fact, the Indians have not been a problem. This has been now what? The war has been over for 7 years, and there's been no repeat of Pontiac's rebellion. So there's, the only reason we have soldiers is to deal with the mobs protesting against the stamps, or against, not the stamps, against the taxes. Well, that doesn't make a lot of sense. You know, if it's costing more money to enforce a law than it's producing, you shouldn't have it. So Parliament had repealed the towns and duties, but the word had not yet reached the Americans. So that's why this incident took place. Now, it was a tragedy. It was a mistake by the soldiers. They did not mean to do this. In fact, the soldiers who fired were breaking their orders. They were violating the orders that the officer had set down. And as a matter of fact, they were then later tried on charges of some sort of manslaughter or something, some not full murder. I don't remember what the exact legal charges were. And interesting, one of the prominent lawyers in Boston agreed to act as the attorney for the soldiers. Now, he was one of the people who was supporting the opposition. He's one of the leaders of the Massachusetts Assembly that's been involved in the protests. His name was John Adams. And he sort of was supporting the protests, but he said, as an attorney, those soldiers are entitled to a fair trial. This is, you know, this is a British Empire. We have some trial by jury. Those soldiers are going to be tried by a jury, and they're entitled to have a lawyer. As you know, that's the way the legal system works. So I'm going to represent them, and they were all acquitted, with except one soldier who had his thumb tattooed as sort of as a mark, so that if he ever did anything, they'd say, "Oh, you were one of the soldiers who fired on that crowd in Boston." Well, the whole thing was overshadowed, and it was a tragedy that 5 people got killed. But there were people in Boston who wanted to make an issue of this. They wanted to have a real problem between England and America. There were people who were thinking about not just protesting against the stamps or against the taxes. They were not just trying to get, you know, taxation with representation as the way it had always been. They were not just trying to get back to the days of salutary neglect. These people were interested in an independent America. These are what we would call left-wing radicals who have gone further than anybody else did. And they are the extremists. They want independence. One of them was a guy named Sam Adams, who was actually a cousin of John Adams. Both of them were prominent in the opposition. Another one was a guy named Paul Revere, who was sort of a craftsman in the city. He was a silversmith of some kind, and he made an engraving, which is in your textbook, so you can see the drawing that he drew, which is totally false. It shows the soldiers acting on order of the officer, which is just exactly the opposite of what happened. The officer was trying to prevent the soldiers from shooting. He didn't want to aggravate the mob. He didn't want to make this thing get worse than it was. So he was telling the soldiers not to fire, but in the drawing that you saw, the engraving that Paul Revere produced to demonstrate this, he's got his arm raised in the soldier, and he's giving the order, fire at will, and the soldiers are firing right into the mob, and terrible. And then, so Paul Revere made that drawing, and they made copies of it and distributed it out. Sam Adams distributed copies of it and referred to this incident as the Boston Massacre. The Boston Massacre. Sort of announcing this the use of troops by the law and order people to fire into the crowd and kill people. An historical note you might want to make there, one of the people who was killed was a young man of color named Crispus Attucks. And another thing that you might note about the drawing by Paul Revere, it shows some of the victims. None of them are men of color, so that didn't make it into the story. But the reality is that one of the first of the 5 people who died fighting for American independence was this young man of color. Crispus Attucks was his name. Well, I mean, this is a tragic event, but in fact, Parliament has repealed the Townsend duties. So the whole thing was kind of unnecessary. People are protesting something that if they'd had a modern day communication system, they would never have protested. It doesn't exist anymore. But it's gone, and eventually the word is out that yes, the tax has been repealed. And we'll pick up at that point in our next class. Now again, today the question is, what was the key that the Stamp Act Congress adopted? What was the phrase that they adopted that presented their position on the Stamp Act? So write that in your paper, and we'll pick up from the story with the end of the tax measure that Americans hated.